Hello and welcome to Autology, the podcast that brings you the latest on automotive technology. Today's episode is called Bidirectional Charging Technologies and Their Role in Global EV Adoption. And you're here with me, Amit Pandey. I am your host for today's session. And our speaker for today is Diana Cusada, our expert in global EV charging infrastructure at S&P Global Mobility. Hey Diana, thank you so much for joining today's episode of Autology.
Hello, Amit. Thank you for having me in today's episode.
You're welcome, Dinah. We understand that EV charging infrastructure is central to mass adoption of battery electric vehicles, as range anxiety continues to be one of the biggest deterrents for buyers who plan to invest in pure EVs. We also know that car makers, EV charging equipment suppliers, charge point operators, and several other stakeholders like energy companies are all working together to expand EV charging infrastructure worldwide. And it's not difficult to imagine a scenario where regions with surplus power are able to achieve adequate charging infrastructure, just like how we have a reliable and spread out network of fuel distribution almost everywhere. But what's difficult to fathom at the moment is what exactly happens when millions of EVs plug into the charging facilities worldwide. Will that be overwhelming for the regional and national power grids? Do we have that kind of surplus power in the first place to provide for charging for EVs? So, Diana, my first question to you is how important you think is the correlation between generation of surplus power and global adoption of electric vehicles?
Okay, so that's a great question. And this is going to be like a recurring answer for a lot of the podcast because it depends. It depends a lot on the country, the region, the city. It really varies geographically how grids are managing their generation and their demand. So lots of regions do have surplus power, and in that case, in the regions that do have surplus power, uh, bidirectional charging is really great. It's really just one of the many things that can be done with that type of technology. In theory, with bidirectional charging, all surplus power can be stored safely and relatively cheaply. And I say relatively because uh, I don't mean by that electric vehicles are cheap or something like that. I say relatively cheaply because you already have the car. You already have your giant battery with wheels, and you might as well use it for something other than to get you to places back and forth, right? So, so with bidirectional charging, one of the things is that your vehicle turns into a giant power storage facility, and stored power can be then used at a more convenient time, either because it's more convenient because it's scarcer or more expensive, or really any other reason why it might be better to use at a later time. In reality, surplus deficit, all the power flow streaming from generation and power quality, grid steadiness, it really depends, as I mentioned, on the country, the region, the city. But with bidirectional charging, the fluctuations between generation and demand of electricity can be managed in a much more efficient way, either to save costs or to integrate intermittent power sources into a grid without compromising its stability. And that's really something that is wanting to be explored. I think we can talk about it in depth a little bit more further down the road, but it's really something very core to the reason why people are very eager to adopt bidirectional charging. Going a little bit back to the beginning of your question, what happens when millions of EVs plug into the charging facilities? It's definitely something that car makers and policymakers are concerned with. because some places, as I mentioned, do have surplus energy and they won't have any issues there. But some cities actually have energy deficits. They need to manage in a different way their power generation. And in those cases, those regions or those locations are actually going to have to increase their power generation. That's basically the only answer in the end. If the energy is not being enough in a certain region to embrace the adoption of electric vehicles, um, some things can happen, right? The prices are very likely to go up. A lot of things can be done regarding the better management of electricity generation and demand with smart management software.
Hmm. That's very interesting. In fact, I've always wondered why the dynamics are so different and how it's going to be very different when it comes to EV charging infrastructure and laying it out, for let's say a developed country versus a developing or an underdeveloped country, because it all eventually boils down to how much of surplus power or is there enough power generation in the country. uh, Theoretically, it sounds very intriguing and useful, and we'll get to learn more about the ongoing applications a little later. But to our audience, Dinah, can you please explain what exactly is the bidirectional charging technology? If you can just explain the fundamentals of it. And is it fair to assume that bidirectional charging could potentially become central to mass EV adoption globally? Because here we are also talking about power grids and their capability to provide sufficient support to charging millions of EVs.
Of course, another great question. So thanks for that. I think in the simplest of terms, bidirectional charging allows electric vehicles to receive power from the grid, but also which all electric vehicles do because that's how they charge. But this capability also allows electric vehicles to send back that power. So there are different types of bidirectional charging technologies, which we can go in depth a little later. But when I say that electric vehicles can receive power and send it back, I mean to almost anything that uses electricity to function. It's a two-way flow that can target a very wide range of receivers on the other side of the electric vehicle. And it is becoming more and more clear every day that vehicle makers are growing more and more interested in this technology. And as such, they are making the adequations for vehicles to have this capability. And this is because I think there are several potential business opportunities for fleet managers, electricity and EV users, and utilities, for example, to use this technology to take advantage and make a profit out of the fluctuations of electricity demand and supply and the different costs of electricity throughout the day. And this is going to sound odd to depending on the country that people are listening to this because in most countries electricity has different prices throughout the day, but not in all. For example, in my country, I'm from Mexico, electricity is something that is very heavily subsidized by the government, and so it actually has the same price for the users at any given time in day. So this is going to sound very foreign concept to people who are listening to in Mexico or in countries like Mexico that only have one single price of electricity throughout the day. But it is very important to clarify that the cost of generating electricity is not the same for the generators in most of the countries. Additionally, there are still several obstacles left to address for this technology to become central to mass EV adoption worldwide. And the main one is going to be interoperability, because there's still a lack of coordination. There are a lot of efforts being done in order to address this, but still, there is a lack of coordination between OEMs, grid operators, and charging infrastructure manufacturers, for example, wallbox manufacturers. And there are some efforts to generate a consensus and to establish communication channels between all parties involved, but there's still a need to make more communication to get all these parties talking between amongst each other in order for this technology to really become critical for mass EV adoption globally.
That's right. Actually, there is a lot that's to be done, and it's just an emerging technology that we're trying to talk about here. But then it's got a huge scope in terms of applications. Can you explain what are the different types of bidirectional charging technologies that are currently being tested out there?
Absolutely. So the first one is the receiver of who is on the other side of the electric vehicle in the bidirectional flow of energy. The most common one is the grid. So this is known as B2G. It basically allows energy to flow from the grid to electric vehicle in order to charge, and then from the electric vehicle back to the grid. And you might be wondering, how is that helpful? But it's actually very useful, for example, for utilities in order to regulate the supply and demand flows during peak hours, and for users because it allows them the liberty to receive energy when it's at its cheapest and then give it back when it's most expensive. So imagine that you have a car that when the energy is the cheapest, sometimes it's like in the middle of the night. Imagine you being able to configure electric vehicle to receive energy to charge when it's that time, right? So when it's at its cheapest. And then during peak hours, like mid-evening or early in the day, it's in most places peak hour for electricity demand. Imagine that at that time, energy is more expensive and your electric vehicle is sitting out there not doing anything. And that's when you program your vehicle to give back the energy to the grid. Depending on the country, depending on the network, depending on the provider, you can give back to the grid for profit. So you sell back to the utility that provides your electricity, or a compensation in your electricity bill. It really depends. It depends not only in the country, in the city, but also in the electricity provider. Because there are a lot that have like special tariffs for electric vehicles and for bidirectional charging. So that's something that really depends on a very granular level up until utility level. Going aside from that, another very trending type of bidirectional charging is vehicle to home, or V2H, which is something that might also be known but not as known as B2G, vehicle to grid. Um, and in that case, the receiver can be the electricity supply or of a house or a home. It doesn't have to be a house, it can be an apartment, it could be a cabin. Typically, it could be an off-grid structure. In that case, you can use your vehicle as a power source for your home, and it can be just like a regular thing that you use the electricity directly from your EV to power your house, but it also can be used as just backup. So a lot of homes in general, in especially in places where there is grid instability and power blackouts, the people have backup generators. Your electric vehicle can function as a backup generator for any kind of structure that you need to. And finally, you can connect your vehicle to any type of device or even another electric vehicle. And the general umbrella term for everything else is just vehicle to X or V2X. And X can be anything. And on the other hand, you can also classify the technology of bidirectional charging in AC or DC. So AC bidirectional charging or DC bidirectional charging. In the case of DC, direct current bidirectional charging, from a technical point of view, it is easier, but it is more expensive. And on the other hand, AC bidirectional alternate current bidirectional charging is cheaper, so the payback period is shorter. However, the problem with that type of bidirectional charging lays in who is going to be responsible of following the grid codes and the protocol to use in the wall box. Because in the case of DC, it's simple to follow the grid code, so the wall box doesn't have a lot of challenges. But in AC, the current conversion is happening in the car. So to follow the grid code, there must be fast enough response time for read changes. And this brings a lot of complexity in the onboard charger of the vehicle.
That sounds very interesting. In fact, you sort of answered my next question as well. But let me ask you that fundamentally, if you can explain our audience how this bidirectional charging technology actually functions. And we're talking about the current receiver and the giver. Almost in every case, it's the power grid, which is the giver of power, and the receiver is the battery electric vehicle. But when bidirectional charging technology comes into picture, you have the EV that is basically giving away the power, and receiver can be anything, as you just explained. So, can you just explain in simple language how the charging technology functions? What exactly happens inside the car with respect to the kind of components that we have that convert the power from, let's say, AC to DC, like you just mentioned about onboard charger? If you can just please throw some more light on it.
Of course, and to explain this, I like to compare a little bit to gasoline vehicles because everyone is very familiar, of course, with gasoline vehicles, right? So I think the audience knows the basics of electric vehicles, right? You have a car, and that car runs on a pretty sizable battery, like a gas tank from a gasoline or internal combustion engine vehicle. When the battery starts to empty, you have to recharge it, just as you would refuel your gasoline tank in your internal combustion engine vehicle, right? But one of the big differences between an electric vehicle and an internal combustion engine vehicle is that, contrary to gasoline car, once you fill your tank, you can only use it in your car. But the power used to run an electric vehicle is the same that can be used to run other things, electricity. Once your electric vehicle is recharged, it turns into a giant battery or battery storage system. And once that happens, it has the potential to power anything that runs on electricity. But in order for that to happen, it needs to have bidirectional charging capabilities, which just means that it can charge as well as be charged. And for that to happen, you need not only bidirectional charging vehicle, but also bidirectional charging infrastructure. So you need those two elements in order to make that happen. You also need a power source and a power receiver. That's typically the grid. And in that case, for example, the grid operator doesn't really need to be bidirectional charging capable because it already is. It's something that is sort of given because of the way the electricity grids are configured. So grid operators really don't need to make any modifications to their offerings. But vehicle makers or OEMs and charging infrastructure providers, those are the ones that need to make electric vehicles and charging infrastructure bidirectional charging capable. Hopefully that's I think that's the simplest terms that I can manage to describe this technology.
That's actually the simplest explanation I've ever heard about how bidirectional charging technology is put to work. If you can please elaborate a bit more and give us a few examples, Tina.
Certainly. I think bidirectional technology definitely made a splash at the IAA in Munich. And I think one of the most commented news from that event was Mercedes-Benz bidirectional charging technology for home chargers. So basically, their new electric GLC will be the first model with bidirectional charging capabilities, but they did mention that more models, including their new CLA series, are going to follow. The vehicle will require a bidirectional charging wall box, which they already announced that will be supplied by the Mobility House. And it will feature a special green energy tariff that includes feed-in tariffs. And it will be a smart and automatic wall box, which users are going to be able to control through their smartphones. It's all being packaged as like a holistic charging experience that's called the MB Charge Home Pro. And it aims to appeal to customers by reducing their home energy costs while contributing to grid stability. Initially, it's only going to be able in certain parts of Europe, like Germany, France, and the UK, but they do plan to introduce it gradually to other markets. But to certain parts of Europe, it's arriving as early as 2026. It's something that it really made a splash. It was really the talk of the town. Also, BMW, it was another one to make an announcement. So BMW is also planning on massifying bidirectional charging, but they're doing that alongside of Eon. They announced that their new BMW iX3 is going to be offering bidirectional charging capabilities using their BMW Wallbox Professional. And in this case, the Wallbox will be featuring a software that was developed jointly by BMW and Eon. And it will also feature a special bidirectional charging electricity tariff. So that's a result of players talking amongst each other, right? On the other hand, Volkswagen also made the announcement that their subsidiary Eli is launching a bidirectional charging pilot program in Germany. And that pilot program is seeking to stabilize the integration of renewable energy sources into the European grid through a managed battery network. For policymakers, for governments, I think the biggest win would be to really integrate renewable sources without compromising the grid stability.
Very interesting. So now I'm able to put the picture of, when you say that why communication is important and why stakeholders must engage with each other to um, put bidirectional charging technology at work and what it can then achieve. So I hope that all these pilot projects that you just explained, they generate positive results and we get to see more of it. I'm curious to understand which automaker do you think was pioneer in introducing bidirectional charging technology in EVs? Was it Nissan or was it Tesla?
I think in terms of technology per se, it was definitely Nissan. Their lead vehicle was the first mainstream electric vehicle with B2G capabilities back in 2018. But Tesla, I think it is doing a really amazing job at positioning the technology as a more user-friendly alternative or something desirable for an EV user. And through their Cybertruck vehicle. I think it's something that used to be a little bit niche or a little bit lesser known, but with Tesla's brand recognition, it enables them to reach a wider array of potential users and explain in more simple terms how EVs can turn into giant batteries to power homes, power tools, return power to the grid, just kind of sell it, kind of saying almost as a lifestyle choice. And I think that's something that Tesla is doing better than anyone.
Okay, that's right, because I think that's what is visible, when we look at the industry players who are implementing this technology. But you mentioned 2018, so this technology is not very new. It's been a couple of years when, as you mentioned, Nissan's first put V2G capabilities at work. That brings me to policy, and I always wonder, Dinah, that is it uh, the innovation that drives policy, or it's the policy that drives innovation, and it's like a chicken and egg situation. Tell me, what do the policymakers say? The adoption of bidirectional charging technology, it's found several mentions in the Industrial Action Plan for European Union's automotive industry roadmap released by the European Commission. And then I was also going through the vision document put out by the US Department of Energy, and their vision plan also has a very detailed roadmap or a large scale deployment of vehicle to grid integration solutions. So can you please tell us in detail about the policy landscape on the deployment of bidirectional charging technologies? I see a lot of evolution there.
Definitely, but spoiler alert, I do think it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation. Just like EVs and charging infrastructure, what happens first? You get so many EVs that to justify the increase in charging infrastructure, or will EVs won't be acquired because there aren't any enough charging infrastructures out there, and so you have to increase those in order for people to convince themselves to buy an EV. Honestly, there is no right answer. It's really a chicken and egg. But regarding the policy landscape, the industrial action plan for the European automotive sector that, as you mentioned, one of the pillars was the establishment of bidirectional charging as a key development for the flexibilization of the European grid. It's also a really huge step in the harmonization of standards for bidirectional charging in order to ensure interoperability between OEMs, charging point operators, which, as I mentioned before, it's something that the harmonization of standards is key for the success of this technology. And this is because one of the hurdles that I often hear from many different players in the industry is that in order for this technology to be adopted, it needs interoperability among different players. On the US side, they released their strategy for achieving a beneficial vehicle grid integration future. And its main pillars are to validate vehicle grid integration solutions, such as pilots, prototypes, and demonstrations of technology. It also stands for the institutional decision-making support, like programs and efforts to integrate different players like utilities, regulators, technology providers, etc. And finally, it seeks to encourage vehicle grid integration innovations, so that to support companies, either if they're from the charging side or the vehicle side, to develop research on this subject. Something that's, I think, a region that's often overlooked, but that recently had some regulatory change is Australia and New Zealand on the other side of the world, but very, very important market, not only for EVs, because there's a lot of potential there, but also for bidirectional EVs because of their grid and like how it's managed geographically. There's a lot of opportunity there for bidirectional charging systems. And now those governments now permit bidirectional charging systems, such as solar or hybrid inverters, to be installed and connected to the grid. The Australian standards, there are two. Um, those standards now govern the installation and performance of inverters, including bidirectional chargers. And the most updated one of those standards was published in the middle of 2024. And the revised version of the second Australian standard was expected by the end of this year, but now it was pushed to the beginning of next year. what the Australian and New Zealand regulator aims to approve bidirectional charging early next year, and most likely to update the standards that they have for wiring to incorporate this technology as part of their inverter systems. So it's a region that is making a lot of efforts for this technology to be developed.
Those are very specific examples and very interesting too. What could be the challenges associated with the large scale deployment of vehicle to grid technology? And I asked this because I was talking to a US based charge point operator recently. They expressed their concerns around who builds the framework of feeding power back into the grid, and like you said, who puts the standards in place, and who builds a secure payment ecosystem around it. How much would you get paid if you let's say feed the power back into the grid at a peak hour? How do you think can those concerns be addressed?
It's funny, but I also recently talked to, I think, a Europe-based CPO, and he mentioned something very similar, which is what I think the feeling is general around the globe. So everyone's having the same discussions, the same hurdles, etc. So on one hand, you have interoperability challenges, making different car manufacturers work with different wall boxes, since in most of the world there's no standard yet, and it's still under development and it's very complex. The system, the different components not being standardized. And there's just a lot of complexity that people don't think about when it's being designed. You think that you will just plug something and you expect it to work, but it's not it's not as easy when different players participate in different parts of the equation, so and in different components of the system, either if it's on the vehicle side or the infrastructure side, it's or even on the grid side. You have to have a protocol that the different grids are going to be able to read, to understand. On the regulatory side, especially for vehicle to grid technology, it is especially hard because vehicle to home technology it is easier, but for vehicle to grid technology, a lot of users would have to upgrade their electrical systems in order to be able to send electricity back to the grid. Not everywhere there's yet a regulation. Most countries, most places have no incentives available for that, and it's still at such an early stage that government is just not that involved yet. The main problem is the lack of coordination between OEMs, grid operators, and infrastructure manufacturers. How to address it? Putting all these players to talk between each other and to coordinate.
On similar lines, Tina, let me talk about this connectivity issue when we talk of bidirectional chargers. And you have, let's say, a scenario where most of the EVs around the world, they have the capability to feed the power back into the grids through the use of bidirectional chargers. And you have millions of bidirectional chargers connected to the grids. We are sort of then looking at having a very secure connectivity framework, just like how we have connected car ecosystem, one of the mega trends, and we already know that getting a car hacked in current scenario is not a big deal. So imagine a similar system where you have power grids connected with millions of bidirectional chargers, which could then expose the vulnerabilities of possibly hacking into a regional or a national power grid. What's your take on this matter? And I think this is still something which people are very rarely discussing, but it could be a big issue. How do you think robust security protocols and policy frameworks will be required for large scale deployment of bidirectional chargers. Because when a policy is drafted, it's not just for a year or two. Typically, it has a very long 10 years, 20 years kind of a roadmap. It's a hypothetical question, but it would be interesting to have your take on this.
That is something very key. And I do think that while like the general public or even in the within the industry, it's not talked as much as it could. But governments are are talking way more about this because it's something that affects mainly them. Um, well, governments or grid operators, because it's as you mentioned a direct threat to the grid. It has a lot of entry points, a lot of vulnerabilities, individual vulnerabilities in the form of each of the EVs that would be connected into the grid in bidirectional charging. So I do think that either governments and or grid operators are in fact taking it very much to consideration for the policies that they're releasing. All the mentioned earlier, the three that we mentioned earlier, have a section dedicated to the security requirements of the vehicle and grid integration technologies, but it's something that is being embedded to the different protocols that are going to be required for bidirectional charging for sure. Even if it's not part of the most common discussion, I do think that we should be talking about this more as part of the industry. But I also understand that the most affected by this is going to be grid operators and governments and or because in some countries like mine, the government is the grid operator. But yes, it's definitely something worth discussing more, but that at the same time has to be part of the policy making process for these protocols.
Wonderful. That makes a lot of sense. Now that we are seeing that stakeholders are beginning to mobilize and communication platforms are coming together, how do you think the car makers will react given we see some sort of initial policy push on bidirectional charging technology? And do you think more and more battery electric vehicles will come equipped with features that can handle this technology, the two-way flow of current? And can you share some statistics on this, please?
Definitely. By our estimation, we do expect over 40% of BEVs, which is purely battery electric vehicles, to have bidirectional charging capabilities across different regions. But we also expect bidirectional charging capabilities to be a technology that is very much region based, with China taking the lead and Europe following. We also expect it to be very key in North America, but less than compared with China. For sure, that is the region that is taking the most advantage of this technology. And in case of South Asia, for example, as I mentioned, there is a lot of potential, especially I think there is a lot of potential for countries depending on a couple of things, including their grid management and the grid segmentation and the integration of renewables in as part of their energy mix, because the higher the portion of renewables in a country, the most it would be benefited by bidirectional charging. And it's something that I do think that policymakers are going to see and are going to take advantage of. And as I mentioned, at the moment, it's just up over 10% in 2025 for bidirectional charging, but we do expect a steep increase in the next 10 years.
This was a very interesting conversation, and there's a lot happening in the global EV technology space as we speak. And there's so much more to cover. Like you just said, Diana, that there's just so much happening, and the more we talk, the less it is. However, that's all the time that we have for today's episode. A big thank you to you, Diana, for taking out time from your extremely busy schedule. It's great to have you on board, and thank you so much for accommodating this episode of Autology.
No, thank you. Thank you definitely for accommodating me. It was a pleasure to be a part of this conversation. It was so interesting. And thanks for having me on the podcast. Happy to be here.
And thank you to all of you listeners for tuning in as well. And we'd love to hear your thoughts on today's episode at our email, which is autology@spglobal.com. And you can find out much more at autotechinsight.spglobal.com. Please don't forget to hit the subscribe, follow, and like buttons to stay on track with the latest Autology podcasts. And we look forward to you joining us again in the next episode. Bye for now.